Junaid Rana states, "The category of Muslim in the U.S. is simultaneously a religious category and one that encompasses a broad race concept that connects the history of Native America to Black America to immigrant America and the consolidation of anti-Muslim racism." Certainly, Rana gets the point of this work. In creating this literature review, I aim to recognize and fill the gaps which some influential race studies fail to recognize. That is, those connections of Islamophobia to U.S. settler colonialism and the concept of the Muslim and the Moor. To racial hierarchies within this country. Many critical race narratives used in ethnic studies curricula do not contain any mention of anti-Muslim sentiment or dismiss it, including those instructional materials which focus on indigenous genocide, the kidnapping and enslavement of Africans, as well as migration and colonial narratives. So let's begin with a rough start of this timeline. 1492, in which the Inquisition's cleansing of blood and edicts of expulsion were enacted against Jews and Muslims of Spain, while at the same time, Columbus sets sail and in an effort to avoid the Muslim war enemy goes west and discovers the New World. The concept of the purity of blood, in which only Christian-born Europeans could claim true cleanliness of blood and spirit, takes hold as conversion is forced upon Jews and Muslims. Ramon Goss-Fugel and Eric Malance note that the purity of blood was a proto-racist process, though not yet fully racist, although the consequences were not that different, and that it served as a technology of power to trace the religious ancestry of the population. Cleanliness of blood meant that even converts couldn't reach the status of Christian-born, which is an essential aspect of character and biological racism. And as Walter Mignolo complicates this further, suggesting that mixed-race Moors were already being positioned differently as distinguishable from the Visigothic whites from Spain. These projects were, of course, inundated by other inherited meanings and descriptions. Keep in mind that these moments followed closely on the heels of the Crusades, in part an attempt to control Muslim trade routes, and as well sanctify the looting and stealing of land, and from which, as Mignolo describes it, discourses of fear develop, leading later to coloniality and the concept of defending sites of power. Additionally, there was a previous dispatching of several expeditions by the Portuguese states to Africa, some of which Columbus was on board, in fact, in an attempt to find a sea route that would lead through the invented boundary between the habitable temperate zones of Europe and the inhabitable torrid zones. This is an important marker in the notion of internal and external imagined boundaries, a transformation of the previous Christian geography, which, as described by Nelson Maldonado Torres, saw Europe as the habitable lands graced by life. The newly discovered people of Africa upset this understanding and were quickly labeled Moors in an attempt to superimpose them into the existing hierarchy. It did not matter much if the people whom they encountered practiced Islam or not for them to be identified as Moors. Having reviewed this history, it is surprising then that the influential scholars in critical race texts, such as Omian Wynant, George Fredrickson, and Howard Wynant, Islam and Muslims are not considered. Junaid Rana notes that Islamophobia in these cases is marked as anti-Semitism, or as religious oppression against Jews, which is attributed to Muslims and then passed on to Spanish rulers. Quote, "Scholars argue that the act of expulsion for Muslims was in the context of war, but for Jews it was no long result of long-standing anti-Semitism. This invisibilization leads to an incomplete understanding of the development of U.S. racial hierarchies. Goss-Fugel and Malance remind us that Islamophobia is not exceptional or an epiphenomenon and must be considered within greater studies of systems of oppression. Unfortunately, this erasure continues in some conversations of transnationalism and the transition of religious hierarchies to racial hierarchies within American Indian studies, Raza studies, Asian American studies, and Africana studies. Mignolo speaks to the significance of the transnational fortification of religious and then racial thinking. Quote, "In 1492, the Moors and the Jews were prosecuted in the Iberian Peninsula. Indians were discovered in the New World, and massive contingents of African slaves were transported through the Atlantic. The discovery of the New World posed a different problem for Western Christians dealing with Muslims, Jews and Turks. If Jews and Moors were classified according to their belief in the wrong God, Indians, and later on black Africans, had to be classified assuming that they had no religion. Thus, the question of purity of blood acquired in the New World had a meaning totally different from the one it had in the Iberian Peninsula. The New World brought a different dimension to the classificatory and hierarchical system. Indeed, opportunities to recognize this move from a religious to racial hierarchy are sidelined. Mignolo continues, today, scholars revisiting the concept of race start in the 18th century, with evidently no idea what happened before 1760, as if the idea really emerged in the heart of Europe without any relation to the European colonies since the 16th century. Shortcomings of influential race stories focus on the 18th century onward, with no regard to the colonial projects of the time. Western Christians, arriving to the Americas, arrived with the experience of dispossessing people and legitimizing appropriation. This foundational history showcases links to developing racial categories, as well as ties together concepts of subjectivity and Eurocentrism. The acknowledgement of the interrelatedness these burgeoning racial classifications work to uncover, the hegemonic frame of knowledge that we continue to study today, along with the interrelated histories of modernity and coloniality. As Nelson Maldonado Torres succinctly puts it, whiteness and blackness themselves did not come into being as categories that denoted race until after the encounter of the Europeans and native people in the Americas. The categories of natives and indigenous, of course, did not exist prior to the conquest and colonialization of what acquired the name America. This recognition can and should strengthen those key critical race studies we study and cite as scholars of ethnic studies. I want to further extend this conversation and suggest that feminist frameworks in the intersections of class, labor, nation, and race may also serve as key analysis in positioning Islamophobia within ethnic studies and critical race descriptions. Roxanne Dunbar-Ortiz adopts these lenses and has noted in her examination of the early English colonies, in language reminiscent of that used to condemn witches, English settlers quickly identified the indigenous populations as inherently children of Satan and servants of the devil who deserved to be killed. Junaid Rana furthers this conversation by highlighting gender and sexuality in the conversation of the racialization of Muslims, noting throughout the 16th century into the 17th and 18th, ideas of racial difference were encapsulated through religious difference, and in the case of Native Americans and Muslims, sexual difference. He continues, through Christian eyes, both Muslims and American Indians were considered sodomites that engaged in widespread homosexuality. This inference was not only based on sexual practices deemed immoral, but the construction of forms of masculinity considered unsuitable to patriarchal Catholicism. These intersections may be used to further understand how the colonizers, especially the British, French, and Spanish, would develop their own concept of settler colonialism in relation to the colonial projects in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, Bohemia Basque Country, and Catalonia, as well as the Islamophobia each brought from their invasions of Arab and Muslim communities. The realization of this colonial residue ties the discussion of Islamophobia as associated with anti-Arab, anti-Asian, and anti-Black racism. In considering some brief historical moments from Islamophobia from 1492 to 1776, I've shown the ways in which key race studies have obscured the reality of Islamophobia from the development of racial thinking. I've noted the importance of introducing the full history of the transition from religious to racial hierarchies, and I have suggested that authors bring in intersectional thought and feminist frameworks that should be more greatly incorporated into our studies. Dr. Paula Baqueta reminds us in a discussion of the feminist queer transatlantic. Perhaps we can begin by recalling what we're urged to forget about in the USA and Europe. For example, that the USA is part of the territory many First Nation peoples have long called Turtle Island. To evoke the space's native name is to resist forced amnesia and its status as settler colony produced through attempted genocide, slavery, and the many forms of labor exploitation of subjects from subaltern sites in the sense of Gramsci in the global South and Europe. Here I would like to touch on the consequences of domesticity in ethnic studies and the removal or incompleteness of the transitional lens. Rabab Abdul-Hadi notes in her discussion of what she terms the foreign-domestic divide, that even the most radical scholars and radical spaces fall to the conventional wisdom of the U.S. Academy and in public discourse. That is, that developments outside U.S. geographical borders are foreign. In this case, invasion, intervention, and oppression of communities not within the U.S. often fail to be connected to racial projects here. Diaspora does not fulfill its full meaning, and Arab and Muslim histories or silence are treated as the special guest. Abdul Hadi reminds us that the nature of ethnic studies is one of justice-centered knowledge. the centralization of the lived experience of marginalized communities, and community-accountable research. This further strengthens the point that critical race theories that do not incorporate the reality of the impact of Islamophobia are not just missing key historical facts, but creating hurdles for the work that we claim as inherent to ethnic studies, as well as minimizing the position of Arab and Muslims as oppressed groups, and dissolving the connectivity between shared or interrelated struggles with other racialized groups. I would like to reflect on those issues as they affect Ahmed Studies programs at San Francisco State University. In the history of the initiative, there has been a constant uphill struggle against the university and influential Islamophobes outside of campus that have aided in carrying out the program's funding, standing firm on refusal to hire desperately needed faculty, and ensuring a lack of resources in classes. Defamatory statements have been made not only by those outside groups who suggested the indivisibility of justice and critical examination of oppression, as well as Arab and Muslim-focused studies are a threat to civil discourse. Ahmed is still not represented with departmental status, nor does it hold a place as a seminar in the graduate program. Despite a continued and growing student interest and support from the community, Ahmed is constantly struggling for basic necessities and support of our students, while other programs outside of the ethnic studies flourish and receive elaborate praise and backing. Now, as a battle for the whole of SFSU ethnic studies is waged with the administration, threatening defunding of the college, the Islamophobia and blocking of the program may be understood within a greater scope of interest by the institutional powers to dismantle critical race studies and the radical and revolutionary lens that grow there. We must challenge the institution's push to deny Islamophobia in its broadest and most complete history. As Ella Shohat and Evelyn Al-Sultani state, ethnic studies has generally assumed a limited and fixed conceptualization of American race ethnicity. Like the census, ethnic studies has defined itself primarily through 4 ethnic categories: African American studies, Asian American studies, Native American studies, and Chicano-Latino studies. This requires the adoption of the Arab and Muslim ethnicities and diaspora studies essential to ethnic studies, and for the protection and encapsulation of the studies within greater race studies and ethnic studies itself. It also requires that Ahmed stand with the ethnic studies in the fight against the university destruction of our programs. It is my goal to continue this research of a comprehensive and critical timeline of Islamophobia. While for now I focus on the period of 1492 to 1776, there's a great need to expand the conversation and make deeper connections to the racial projects since the institutionalization of the U.S. settler colonial state. Additionally, such a narrative would also benefit from a thorough discussion of the intertwined nature of Orientalism, anti-Arab racism, and Islamophobia through these multiple periods. Most definitely, the goal of my work is to highlight the importance of recognizing Islamophobia as central to and influenced by racial and religious hierarchies, and following the path and involvement of such structures and their oppressions throughout time, and always continue with a comparative lens. Thank you so much. I'm hoping to receive your feedback and critical insights, and I appreciate the audience that you've granted me today.
Thank you so much, Heather. That was fabulous. Thank you. Okay, our next speaker, we're going to arrange a translation. Should we both be standing here, or we both stand here? So our next speaker is Cordia Buteja, who is the spokesperson and co-founder of the Party of the Indigenous of the Republic in France. The title of the talk is not the same as what was written here. What was written as Towards the Politics of Revolutionary Love is actually the subtitle of a recent book that she just wrote, which is called Whites, Jews, and Us, Towards the Politics of Revolutionary Love, a book that actually caused a huge crisis in France for, I guess that's not even an exaggeration to say that. It's all over the media and everything, and she's been accused of everything.